Hi, I'm Jan Howell, and I'm so excited that you are ready to make a cute pilot or pixie cap using upcycled sweaters or sweatshirts or a nice new piece of fleece. Let's just go over a few of the items and materials that you'll need for this project. First, you'll need to download and print your pattern. You'll need a measuring device, a ruler or a measuring tape, straight pins, a pair of paper scissors for the pattern, and fabric scissors for your fabric. A roller blade and a ruler if you have one available, not necessary, but it does make things a little easier. Some matching thread and your upcycled sweater or fleece for the hat, and also we'll be cutting strips of either the sweater fabric or fleece. For the cap, I'm going to use this pink cashmere for the lining of one of the hats and the fleece for the outer and for the binding. And you can use an upcycled sweater of any kind. You can use wool blends or wool or cotton blends. I'm going to use a gray fleece for the binding on this hat. So gather up your goods and we'll get started. If you haven't already enrolled in my DIY sweater upcycling class, I encourage you to do that. That will give you some great ideas and tips for choosing your sweaters and fabric for your projects. So the first thing we're going to do is cut the strips of fleece for your binding. If you have a big piece of fleece, it's good to fold it in half and make sure that the fold is on the grain. That means it's not twisted, that the stretch is even, and that your edge is even. So get a nice even edge, and then using your rotary cutter or scissors, cut 2-inch strips. To measure the face binding, you're going to look at your neck binding measurements on your pattern, the front page of your pattern, and cut it the indicated length for your size. Next, you'll be cutting the neck binding, which is quite a bit longer, depending on, so from anywhere from 36 to 40 inches you will need. Now, if you don't have a piece long enough, I'm going to be showing you how to piece them together. Sometimes you may not have a strip long enough to do that. So to sew two pieces together, you'll take your 2-inch strips and put them at a right angle like I'm showing you here, and overlap the edges 1/4 inch so that it hangs over 1/4 inch on the top and the side. Right sides together, and then we're going to take it to the machine and sew from that little corner notch to the other corner notch. Back stitching at the top of the seam, go ahead and sew a straight line down to the corner notch. Make sure you get it right in that corner, and then cut the little tabs off at the top and the bottom so they're flat and even with the binding. So when you open it up, it should look like one continuous piece of fabric, and it will stretch equally. And now you have an extended piece of fleece. Now to cut out the cap, take the fabric or the sweater that you've decided to use. If it has a stripe or a pattern, make sure that it's lined up, and you're going to fold it in half so it's big enough for the cap size. Place the pattern on the fold where indicated on the pattern so the edge is right on the fold, and pin it in place. Decide what part of the fabric you want to show, what stripes you want to show, what colors, and whatever. Pin it in place and then cut it out. If you decide to line the cap, which you always don't need to do, but it's kind of nice to give it a little bit of thickness and warmth, place your pattern on top of the fleece. I'm just using fleece here, or a thin cashmere knit, or a neat t-shirt works really well too. You can just I don't even pin it, I just lay it on top because it will hold in place just fine. Now if you're using the cuffed edge of a sweater, you will be cutting this out just a little bit differently. I'm going to demo this on this Pixie hat that I'm making out of this red cashmere sweater. You'll take the pattern piece, and where it says to place on the fold, place it on the fold against the edge of the fold and on the edge of the cuff. So when you do it this way, you don't have to use the face binding because you'll be using the nice cuffed edge of a sweater. But you do have to cut it out just a little bit differently. So I want you to mark the edge of the hat there, and then we're going to flip up the pattern and measure 1 inch from the pin and mark it with a pin. So to get the stretch that we would otherwise with the binding, we're going to pull the fabric down to meet the edge of that pin. So we're going to stretch it and then pin it in place. So the pattern will be gathered up a bit. See how that's bigger? And then that will help us get the right angle for the neck edge. And then you'll just cut it out that way while the face edge is kind of bunched up a bit. So just kind of hold it in place while you cut out the neck edge. And it'll look kind of funky and kind of gathery, but that's how it's supposed to be. Then you'll get that nice fit around the face. All right, that's it. And we'll get ready to sew the binding on and cut out the binding. So to get your sewing machine ready for your sewing project, place it on a straight stitch with the length at about 2.5. Thread your machine and your bobbin with a corresponding color of thread. And we'll take your pieces, the hat pieces, place them right sides together. Line up the edges, and we're going to be sewing from that open seam around the edge to the fold. You can pin it in place if you want to. Do that with both your outer piece and your lining, and then we'll take it to the machine to sew. Starting from the open edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is usually the edge of your presser foot, back stitch and start sewing around the edge. And we're going to taper off at the fold at an angle as smooth as you can, so there's not a puff or a pleat there. So you can just really taper it off and back stitch. Clip your edge. See how we just tapered that gradually, going from your seam allowance to nothing. Do that with both. Take your scissors and trim that seam a little bit, making sure not to get too close to the seam, just to get rid of some of that bulk. So you'll do that with both pieces. Now to apply the face binding, you're going to take the outer shell and turn it right side out. The lining will be right side in, and you'll just stuff it inside each other and line up the edges and your seams and pin it in place. So your face binding will be the piece that doesn't have the seam, that's going to go all the way over the top of the head. And this will be the shorter binding piece that you cut out. Set that aside for a minute, and we'll take the short binding piece that you cut out, fold it in half, and mark the center point with a pin. Then fold it in the half, the end to the half, and mark the quarter place with a pin. We're going to do the same thing with the cap. Fold it in half, mark the halfway point with a pin, and then fold it in half again to mark the quarter pieces. Just kind of line up your fabric edges as you do that. And then you'll take your fleece, the right sides facing the right side of the hat, line up the center points, mark it or pin it in place, remove the extra pins, and you'll notice that the binding will be shorter than the cap, which is good because that just a little bit, that'll give it a little bit of a stretch and keep it nice and taut over the face. I'm going to take it to the machine now, line up your edges at the beginning with the fleece side up, take it to the machine, and again a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitch, and start to sew. Now you're going to be sewing 3 layers of fabric together, so take your time to line up the edges and pull out your pins as you sew. You'll pull the binding to stretch as you sew. Make sure you don't go over the pins, break a needle. Line up the edges, the final edge, and back stitch. Clip your threads. And then we're not going to trim the seam too much here. Now this is the fun thing. We're going to fold the binding over the top, and there'll be excess, so no worries. We're just going to fold it over. Make sure that the seam is facing away. So you kind of have to rub it with your fingers and get it so that the seam is facing out. The seam allowance is facing out, and it'll be you're folding the binding over the top. So we're going to continue to go down the seam and pin it in place, overlapping, and we're going to be stitching in the ditch. So once you get that all folded, bring it to the machine, and with the binding facing down so that you can see the binding where the binding meets the hat. We're going to sew right in that crevice. This makes it so you can't even see the stitching. Sewing right in the crevice. Take your time. So you can see there's quite a bit of an excess. No worries, that's okay. So fleece and knit will not fray, so there's no worries about this fraying. So we're going to take and flatten your scissors and just cut off the edge of the binding as close to the seam as you can without cutting into the seam. Be careful not to cut into your hat. So if you lay your scissors flat and cut, get a nice clean edge. So just take time to cut out and make those edges even. So this is the beautiful thing about this trick, sewing this binding. So that's the face binding. We'll get ready to do the neck binding. If you haven't enrolled in my binding tutorial class course, which is free also, that's a good video class to watch before you do this as well, if you have questions or concerns. Okay, now that you have applied the face binding, now we're going to apply the neck binding, which is the bottom edge that has the seam. Take your long piece of fleece that you cut out and measure 15 inches from the end and mark with a pin. And do that with both edges. And then take your piece and fold it in half and mark the halfway point with a pin. So now you're going to take that halfway point with the right sides of the fleece to the right side of the cap where the seam is. The seam will be the halfway point where you will apply the binding. Pin it in place and then take the pin that you measured 15 inches and bring it to the edge, the very edge of the cap, and pin in place. Take that to the sewing machine and we're going to sew the binding to the cap from the edge of the cap to the other edge. We'll get to the ties in just a minute. So again, we're sewing through 3 layers of fabric, so take your time to line up the edges and remove your pins. You'll back stitch at the top and then at the back. So if you're going to apply a cute tag to your hat, this is the time to do that. Just slide it in there and apply it along the bottom edge. This is optional, of course. When you get to the edge, back stitch and cut your threads. If you do have a tag, clip that off, and then we're going to sew the ties. If there's any bulk, just trim that with your scissors. So again, you're going to fold the binding over with the raw edge and the seam allowance outside, towards the outside, facing outside, folding that binding over the seam. Just working your fingers to get it even and flat and pin in place. So do that all the way along the edge of the cap. Kind of helps just to use your fingers to feel where the edges of the seam allowance is to make sure that that is folded over. Really important. So now we're going to sew the ties. We're not going to top stitch quite yet. So to sew the ties, you're going to bring the right sides of the tie together. Make sure that you open that make sure that the right sides are together. Pin it in place. And you're going to leave about an inch open between the hat and the tie. So right sides together on the other side. Go ahead and pin it in place. Leaving a gap about an inch, inch and a half at the towards the hat. Now we're going to need to use a different stitch so the seam doesn't pop. We're going to use a small zigzag stitch so the seam, when the tie is pulled when you're tying it, doesn't pop the seam. So just do about a 2-inch width and shorten the length to about 1. With that small zigzag stitch, back stitch, sew the very end, leave your needle in, pivot, and then sew down the edge. Back stitching and stopping at that inch point where you marked it with a pin. So let's do the other side. Sewing along the edge, the very bottom, pivoting, and then sewing down the lengthwise. Again with that small zigzag stitch. Trim the corner and the ends, and now we're going to get ready to turn the ties inside out. You might need to trim, you'll need to trim some of that bulk away to make it easier to turn. So you can use a turning stick, that's just like a little dowel that you can get, or just use a pencil, the bracer end of a pencil. It kind of takes a little bit to start it, to get that end poking in. Just poke it in and gather it up until you can pull it inside out. Take the turning stick back inside to poke out the very ends. Now to close off that inch that we left, leave it in the zigzag stitch, and we'll fold the ends underneath so it's the same width as your tie, and just hold it in place. Back stitch and sew that closed. So you're top stitching on just the top of the tie. When you get to the hat point, keep your needle in, and now we're going to change the setting back to a straight stitch. And once again, we're going to sew in the ditch of that seam on your binding. Stitching in the ditch, removing your pins, and then when you get to the end, you're going to leave your needle in the fabric and change it back to the zigzag stitch so you can sew the other tie closed, poking the ends in, closing off that seam, back stitching. Just take time to trim the threads. And now we're going to trim the fleece binding on the back like we did before. Just making sure that you get all the ends even. It's nice and looks nice. Once again, don't worry about it fraying if it's knit. And there you have it. Nice finished edges, cozy and soft. So I hope you enjoyed that fun little project. I am going to show you also how to make the pixie cap, which is very similar, just has a different shape head. To make your pixie cap, take your fabric piece and with right sides together, fold it in half and line up the back or the neck edge. We'll be sewing the back head seam first. So just pin it in place if you need to, and then start at the base of the neck and sew up to the point. And you'll just proceed with the binding just as with the pilot cap. So just follow the instructions for the pilot cap for the binding on the pixie cap. They're the very same, and you'll get the same results. And there you have it, your cute little whimsy pixie cap, ready for your little one's head. I hope you have as much fun sewing these up as I do. Your kids will love them. And make sure if you have any questions that you send me a note and I'll walk you through it. See you in the next class.